Let's start. You are currently working more hours than a 14th century medieval peasant. You have electricity, you have algorithms, you have the accumulated knowledge of human history in your pocket. Yet, mathematically, you spend significantly more of your waking life engaged in mandatory labor than a person who literally farmed dirt in the Middle Ages. This is the great paradox of the modern economy. We are the most technologically advanced, hyper-productive civilization to ever exist, and yet we are perpetually exhausted. We accept the 40-hour work week as if it is a biological necessity, a fundamental law of nature passed down since the dawn of time. But it isn't. It is a completely fabricated system. And to understand how the richest humans in histories were tricked into an endless, grinding marathon of labor, we have to look at the weaponization of a completely invisible technology. We have to look at the clock. To understand what humanity lost, you have to understand how we used to live. Let's look at a man named Thomas. Thomas is a typical English peasant living in the village of Oakington in the year 1340. His life is undoubtedly hard. He has no running water. His diet consists mostly of coarse bread and ale, and modern medicine is centuries away. But Thomas possesses something that a modern corporate executive does not: complete ownership of his own time. In the medieval world, work was task-based, not time-based. Thomas woke up with the sun, went to the fields and ploughed his lord's land. When the land was ploughed, he stopped. There was no concept of looking busy until 5 p.m. If it rained, he went inside. If the harvest was finished, he rested. The pace of human life was entirely dictated by the seasons, the weather, and the biology of the human body. And then there was the church. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was the ultimate enforcer of mandatory time off. They maintained a massive calendar of mandatory holidays, feast days, saints' days, and festivals. In addition to every single Sunday, there were roughly 150 days a year where work was strictly forbidden. Add in the fact that agricultural work practically ceases during the dead of winter, and records show that the average peasant in the 14th century only performed formal labor for their lord roughly 150 days a year. Now, this doesn't mean Thomas was sitting on a beach the rest of the time. Survival in the 1300s required constant daily chores: chopping wood, fixing roofs, feeding animals, and baking bread. But the critical difference is this: Thomas owned his own rhythm. He spent his afternoons drinking ale in the village square, participating in wrestling matches, or attending massive multi-day village feasts. It was incredibly common for workers to take a midday nap, a siesta, often mandated by local custom. But this task-based, leisurely existence was a massive problem for the ruling class. In the mid-1300s, the Black Death swept across Europe, wiping out roughly a third of the population. Suddenly, labor was incredibly scarce. Because there were far fewer peasants to work the fields, the surviving peasants like Thomas realized they had leverage. They began demanding higher wages and refusing to work for cheap. The wealthy nobility panicked. They passed draconian laws like the Statute of Laborers in 1351, literally making it a crime for a peasant to ask for a raise or to refuse work. They tried to legally force the peasants to work longer and harder, but laws alone couldn't break the natural, seasonal rhythm of human life. To force humanity into a relentless grind, the wealthy elite needed a new machine. They needed a paradigm shift that would sever the connection between human biology and human labor. They needed the Industrial Revolution. Enter Richard Arkwright. Arkwright was a ruthless, brilliant English entrepreneur in the late 1700s. He is often called the father of the factory system. Arkwright didn't just invent machines. He invented a terrifying new way to organize human beings. In 1771, he built the first highly successful water-powered cotton mill at Cromford. Inside this massive brick building were towering, complex spinning frames powered by the rushing water of the river. These machines were incredibly expensive to build, and this single economic fact changed the trajectory of human history. Because the machine was expensive, every minute it sat idle was a minute. Arkwright was losing money. A medieval plough could sit in the mud for a week, and it cost the lord nothing. But an industrial machine demanded a constant, unyielding return on investment. Therefore, the machine could not stop. And if the machine could not stop, the human beings attached to the machine could not stop. Arkwright realized that he could no longer rely on the task-based labor of the past. He couldn't have workers leaving when they felt tired, or taking long afternoon naps, or disappearing for a 3-day religious festival. So Arkwright and his fellow industrialists weaponized the clock. They created the shift system. They locked the factory doors at a specific minute. If you were 5 minutes late, you were locked out and lost half a day's pay. They hired overseers to patrol the floors, ensuring that no one spoke, no one sat down, and absolutely no one stopped moving. Human beings were no longer paid for completing a task. They were paid for surrendering a specific block of their time. Time is money. It is a phrase we accept as a universal truth today, but it was invented in the factories of the 18th century as a tool of absolute control. This was the darkest moment in the history of human labor. The transition from the field to the factory was a psychological and physical slaughter. Men, women, and children were forced to work 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. The environment was deafening, suffocating, and incredibly dangerous. Because the machines could never be turned off, small children were hired to crawl underneath the massive moving moving gears to clean up cotton dust. If a child fell asleep from exhaustion, they were maimed or killed by the relentless spinning metal. The human body was fundamentally incompatible with the mechanical rhythm of the factory. We are not designed to perform the exact same repetitive motion for 16 hours straight without sunlight or rest. But the machines didn't care, and the factory owners didn't care. The wealth generated by these factories was staggering. Men like Arkwright became fabulously rich, but the working class was plunged into a dystopian nightmare of poverty, disease, and absolute exhaustion. They had traded the freedom of the medieval fields for the imprisonment of the industrial clock. The backlash was inevitable. By the 1800s, the working class had reached the absolute breaking point. They began to organize, striking and protesting against the brutal 16-hour days. This is where the concept of the 8-hour workday was born. The rallying cry of the labor movement was simple: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. It took over a century of incredibly violent struggle. Workers were beaten, arrested, and shot by private police forces simply for demanding the right to go home to their families. Eventually, the pressure became too great for governments and corporations to ignore. In 1926, Henry Ford famously instituted the 5-day, 40-hour work week in his automobile factories. But make no mistake, Ford didn't do this out of the kindness of his heart. Ford realized two very cynical, mathematically brilliant things. First, if his workers were constantly exhausted, they made mistakes on the assembly line, which cost him money. Second, and more importantly, if his workers were locked in a factory for 16 hours a day, they literally didn't have any free time to buy or drive the cars he was trying to sell them. The 40-hour work week wasn't a humanitarian victory. It was a calculated economic compromise. It was the exact amount of time required to maximize a worker's physical output, while leaving them just enough free time to become consumers and buy the products they were making. By 1940, the US government officially codified the 40-hour work week into law with the Fair Labor Standards Act. The working class celebrated. They had fought the machine and won a massive victory. But what they didn't realize was that the 40-hour week was never meant to be the final destination. In 1930, the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes made a famous prediction. He looked at the rapid pace of technological innovation and predicted that within 100 years, by 2030, humanity would be so incredibly productive that we would only need to work 15 hours a week. Keynes believed that machines would eventually do the heavy lifting, freeing humanity to pursue art, leisure, and philosophy. Fast forward back to today. Keynes was absolutely right about the technology. Today, a single worker with a laptop and an AI software suite can produce more economic value in an hour than an entire room of accountants could produce in a month in 1930. Our productivity has skyrocketed exponentially, but we didn't get the 15-hour work week. We didn't get the free time. Instead, we got the endless, creeping expansion of the corporate grind. Why? Because the modern corporate structure operates on the exact same logic as Richard Arkwright's water frame. The system is designed for infinite growth. If a new technology makes you twice as efficient, your boss doesn't let you go home at noon. Your boss expects you to produce twice as much output by 5 p.m. The ghost of Richard Arkwright still haunts every modern office building. We don't work in cotton mills anymore. We work in glowing cubicles. We don't have overseers with whips. We have Slack notifications and tracking software that monitors our mouse movements. We carry our factories in our pockets, responding to emails at 9 p.m. on a Sunday. The clock hasn't disappeared. It has just become invisible, and the psychological toll is devastating. We are a society suffering from mass burnout, anxiety, and a profound sense of exhaustion. We are biologically wired for the task-based, seasonal rhythm of Thomas, the medieval peasant, but we are trapped in the relentless, mechanical loop of the industrial machine. If you want to understand how these invisible systems were built and how they continue to control your everyday life, hit subscribe. We explore the hidden history of money, the mechanics of power, and the economic forces that shape our reality. We look back at medieval peasants with pity, imagining their lives as a dark, miserable struggle for survival. But Thomas knew something that we have completely forgotten. He knew that work was a means to an end, not the meaning of life itself. He knew when the harvest was finished. He knew when to stop. We never do. The machines became infinitely faster, but they didn't set us free. They just raised the quota. The next time you feel a wave of guilt for taking a nap or leaving the office exactly at 5, remember who put that guilt inside your head. The 40-hour work week isn't a natural law. It's just a heavily negotiated truce in a war that started 200 years ago. And right now, the machine is winning.